This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Oh, wow, Raw and SmackDown are so much better now, they said. Oh, the booking is so much better now, they said. Oh, wow, things are so much better off without Vince in the picture, they said. You know, there's a term for that. You know what they call it? The honeymoon phase. When you're so in love with the notion or the idea of something being so great that you're totally blinded by the reality of what's right in front of you the entire time. I mean, we've been living it in real time for the better part of 3 years with AEW, and only now are people finally coming around to recognizing, you know what? That product is not as great as people chalked it up to be. You think? Geez, I've been saying that since the first episode of Dynamite ever aired. Here we are in the fall of 2022, and well, now people are finally coming around to it. Better late than never, I guess. You know, here we are with people trying to pull the same crap with WWE now that Vince is gone. People saying, oh, everyone should check out Raw and SmackDown. The shows are so much better now. I mean, maybe they have been. Who really knows? But God, after watching this week's SmackDown episode, what's that really saying? I mean, I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt here, but man, oh man. And it's not to say everything about this past Friday night SmackDown was horrendous or appalling. Like, there were a handful of good things they sprinkled in throughout the show, but God, if this is the product that's supposed to be 10 times better without Vince calling the shots, Christ, how bad was it really when Vince was overseeing things? I mean, I imagine it was horrible, but good Lord. And we'll talk about that show today because I have a decent amount to say about it. But in addition, we're also going to be covering the next Retro Raw from 1993 as part of the Retro Raw extension, or I should say the Retro Review extension. A show that was not much better than SmackDown this week 20-odd something years ago, but at the very least I can say Retro Raw had some honest-to-God star power on it. Outside Roman Reigns, I guess. So if you're checking out the 5 Starr Wrestling Report for the first time, make sure to subscribe and come back to check out the show every Monday and Friday for new content. We are on YouTube and Rumble for each weekly podcast. If you'd also do me a solid and like the show and leave a comment to share your feedback on everything we talk about today, it'd be greatly appreciated. We're gaining some leverage on this small little YouTube channel, and I do appreciate everyone who voluntarily takes the time out of their busy schedules to sit back and listen to the show while you're doing other things. It is an audio-based program for a reason because I do value people's time. And I try to make sure I make it easy on everyone that has other stuff going on in their lives so you can multitask. Because I sure know I do it when I listen to podcasts all the time. Plus, I mean, you really don't want to see my ugly face anyway, so audio it is. Anyway, are we ready to dive into this thing? I think I'm about ready. Let's get this train wreck rolling and over with. On to Retro Raw. By the way, for those keeping score at home, this would be the September 27th, 1993 episode. And we started the program with a little interesting tidbit of history. The show begins with President Jack Tunney announcing that, and I quote, "Due to his failure to fulfill his obligations as champion, Shawn Michaels has been stripped of the Intercontinental Championship." And of course, I immediately laughed as soon as I heard this because with being able to look back at this show with historical knowledge, I know the reason why Shawn was stripped of the belt. And, well, for anyone out there that wouldn't consider themselves fans of Shawn from back in the day, boy, was this just a precursor to how bad things would get a couple years later. But for those that don't know, I can fill you in with the details here. Not that you couldn't just look this up on the web anyway, but to save you some time, the story pretty much goes, Shawn had tested positive for steroids, and obviously this was right at the height of the steroid scandal trial. So to say this was impeccably poor timing on Shawn's part to be pulling a charade like this probably is putting it mildly. Now, of course, to this day, Shawn has neither denied nor confirmed this incident. So in other words, he couldn't own up to it. And this had obviously come out a few years before they dug deeper into Shawn's ongoing problems with substance use, and lo and behold, they come to find out that he had an addiction problem. Who would have thunk it? So, yeah, that pretty much sums up the whole story. He would end up returning in a couple months at Survivor Series as a replacement in the Jerry Lawler tag match with Brett, but for the time being, he was written off in story. And that is when they made the announcement here that there would be a 20-man over-the-top rope battle royal next week to determine 2 top contenders, and then those 2 would go on to wrestle on the following episode of Raw to determine the actual champion. So yeah, Shawn Michaels' red flags going off here in the year 1993, and God, would it only get insufferably worse in the years to come. And keep in mind, I'm a little biased because I was not a fan of Shawn Michaels around this point. I did end up coming around to him after he got himself clean and came back for his second run in the early 2000s, but 90s WWF Shawn Michaels, not a fan. And you can go back and listen to me talk about that on some of the recent WWF Raw recaps if you want a deeper dive into that whole tale. I guess my collective thoughts on everything looking back is, like, clearly they had to have known this was a bad sign. And when you consider where WWF was at this point in terms of their legal battles with the steroid scandal, why in the fuck you would ever trust a guy like that again is beyond me. Like, if I were Vince during this period and I caught wind that anybody in my company was testing positive for steroids, you can bank on me never pushing that mofo in any top spot ever again, much less putting my fucking world title on him. But that's just my take. So anyway, we were officially on the road here for Monday Night Raw. We were in New Haven, Connecticut at the New Haven Coliseum, I think is what they called it. As noted last week, that was the last episode of Raw that they taped from the Manhattan Center in New York for quite a while, actually. But boy, were these people fired up. This New Haven crowd was deafening at the start of this show. So deafening that Vince, Bobby, and Savage all had great difficulty hearing each other in the show opening plugs. So then we cut to Tatanka versus one of my personal guilty WWF pleasures to go back and watch in my spare time, the model Rick Martel. And we did have one of those major commentary blunders in this segment between the Macho Man and Vince. And by that, I mean the fault was purely on Vince and nobody else. Because early on in the match, Savage was mentioning the fact that we shouldn't expect a technical classic between these two because they have history with one another. And meanwhile, almost in the same breath, Vince McMahon passingly mentions that he does not believe Tatanka or Martel have ever wrestled before. So apparently Vince completely forgot about WrestleMania 8, wherein one of the featured matches on that card was Tatanka versus Rick Martel. A match that happened 1 year prior in 1992. So let the record show, Vince's senility was already kicking in by the early 1990s. We also had a pretty iconic moment in this match where Martel did one of those show-offy cartwheels to mock Tatanka, and Bobby Heenan asked the Macho Man, "So Savage, as a pro wrestler yourself, if you see someone doing a cartwheel during your match, how does it affect your psyche?" God almighty. If only Bobby Heenan was around to see what would happen by the year 2022 in the business, wherein all the guys do in matches anymore are cartwheels and backflips and gymnastic tumbling. Like, that actually legitimately made me roll my eyes hearing that statement, just realizing how far this business has fucking crumbled in the last 20 years. There was a spot right before the break in this match where Tatanka knocked Martel out to the floor, and while Martel kept trying to get back into the ring, Tatanka would keep on going after him to try and yank him back in by force. And this apparently meant to the Macho Man that he was stalling. To which I said, Tatanka is refusing to let the guy get back into the ring under his own accord. The fuck is he talking about by saying he's stalling? Tatanka is just being a dick. There was actually a really scary bump, too, that Tatanka took moments later. He ran into the slippery turnbuckle issue a lot of guys ran into back in the day. But unlike in a lot of circumstances where the heel immediately cuts them off to try and cover for the botch, Tatanka here said, "Damn it, I'm going for this crossbody dive." And it led to him recklessly leaping off the second rope, wherein after Martel ducked, Tatanka almost came landing right on his face and neck. Nearly ended in tragedy. But they came back from break and had Martel work over Tatanka for the extended heat. And, they'd have Tatanka milk some small comebacks here and there, but Martel was generally on offense and gaining the upper hand on him. And finally, it boiled down to a deal where Martel tried to bounce Tatanka's head into the corner buckle, but Tatanka started coming back. And after trying to charge Martel, he ended up sidestepping and dumping Tatanka out to the floor. So as the model goes out to the floor to keep brawling with him, they both end up getting counted out, which, by the way, I wrote this down as a side note for both AEW and WWE. Take note, gang. When you have a guy out on the floor getting counted out, just because you are in the ring and you voluntarily exit the ring to go out to the floor as well, it does not automatically mean that you break the count. It's one of the biggest pet peeves of mine in wrestling today, where someone is in the ring watching someone getting counted out, and the guy in the ring goes out to the floor to keep fighting, and this somehow randomly results in the official stopping the 10 count and starting over from scratch. Fuck, that is so stupid. So, well, I think they played this up as the first time Tatanka's matches have ended in some kind of screwy finish, because keep in mind, this is still during the whole undefeated win streak, which should have been an art of foreshadowing, because it evidently comes to a drastic halt in a couple weeks after he gets killed by Ludwig Borga, and that basically spelled the end of Tatanka's career as we knew it, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So after this, we went to Joe Fowler in the production truck. And yes, for those wondering, this is the same Joe Fowler who we saw conducting interviews at the 1993 SummerSlam. The overacting was abysmally horrible there, and certainly wasn't any better here on Monday Night Raw. There wasn't a drop of testosterone anywhere in that man's body, but they ran down the series of participants in the Battle Royal next week to crown the two contenders for the Intercontinental title. And I believe I jotted all these names down. I'm going to give it my best go here. keep a counter track if you're watching here so you can roast me in the comments if I miss some. We have Erwin R. Scheiser, Macho Man Randy Savage, Adam Baum, who is indeed explosive, Giant Gonzalez, Mr. Perfect, Owen Hart, Rick Martel, Jimmy Snuka, Bob Backlund, Pierre and Jacques of the Quebecers, Razor Ramon, Mabel from Men on a Mission, Diesel, Steve Lombardi, playing the role of MVP. And for the record, no, that is not the same MVP of the latter years of WWE. It is Steve Lombardi under another series of multiple goofy gimmicks he was given during this run in the 90s. And I believe this one lasted all of maybe this one battle royal before they scrapped the idea entirely. Probably because it was so fucking stupid. The 1-2-3 Kid, Bam Bam Bigelow, Marty Jannetty, Tatanka, and finally, to cap it off, the main attraction of all attractions, Bastion Booger. Yeah, this rundown gave me a lot of perspective on WWF's talent pool around this point. There were a lot of shitty gimmicks going on. Some real great talent underneath those gimmicks, but I mean, they didn't call it the cartoon era for nothing. So that was that. By the way, I loved how they put his screen capture up here when Fowler was talking about how Michaels had the belt taken away from him. And on the screen, it just read, "Stripped," in all caps, with Shawn Michaels walking down the aisleway. Highly comical for an array of reasons. After that, we had a Ludwig Borga squash, wherein the only thing I wrote down about it was the visible sign in the front row that read, "Luger sucks," spelled S-U-X. So yeah, that guy's career was pretty much rendered dead by this point. Following that, we had the Superfly in action here. Jimmy Snuka, back for a very short WWF run here in 93. And by very short, I legitimately mean for basically 2 weeks. I believe he competed in this match and the following week in the Battle Royal and was essentially gone afterwards. And, well, here's the thing. I am not going to spend 5 hours talking about Snuka's demons. It's a very controversial topic whenever it comes to Snuka's personal life, and it's so volatile where the mere mention of the name Jimmy Snuka sends chills down a lot of people's spines. And it's almost kind of on par with the whole Chris Benoit treatment, where people have argued whether or not Snuka's name should be banished from wrestling history. And for my money, I'm personally not an advocate of trying to erase people or events from history. If you are someone that grew up as a Superfly fan, it probably hits home a little harder reading up on the murder allegations and the whole Nancy Argentino story. Again, not going to go into it for the sake of time here. Snuka was a little before my time, so it wasn't like I grew up watching him in his prime or would have even considered myself a major fan of his. You know, I've obviously seen clips of his, and I can recognize how much of a tremendous talent and megastar he was, particularly for the WWF. Again, we live in a real toxic culture today where people try to censor or cancel famous celebrities for all the horrible shit they've done in the past. And moreover, it's not so much just about canceling or admonishing someone, but it's a legitimate attempt to try and wipe them from society, to try and pretend that they never existed as a human being. And to me, that is where you just cross the line into pure extremism. It's like the whole Benoit discussion, which is something that I can relate to a little more because I was actually a very big fan of his. Can you ever reconcile what Benoit did? No. Will I ever absolve him of those grave sins? Absolutely not. Do I think he should rot in the proverbial hell pit for what he did? Probably. It's a touchy subject, much like the Snuka story is. So, how you feel about him, how you perceive Snuka is really kind of dependent on whether or not you grew up watching him and how hard it hits when you see that one of your childhood heroes turned out to be someone that you never thought he could be. So if you're one of those people that never want anything to do with the guy ever again or refuse to watch any of his matches, I get it. However, one thing we can't deny. Snuka's WWF theme music. That shit slaps. I play some of it here, but I don't want to get hit with a copyright strike. Not that that really matters on this channel. But I will encourage you to go listen to it in the background because it's quite the catchy little tune, if you can stomach it. And I'll say this. If you're looking for a quality Jimmy Snuka match to go back and watch in your free time, you may want to skip over this one. This was not what you would call a peak performance from the Superfly. Obviously, all joking aside, he was obviously well past his prime by this stage, and he wasn't really in the best ring conditioning either by 93. He didn't look horrible or anything, but it wasn't something I'd recommend you go check out if you're trying to remember Jimmy Snuka for his ring work. And to tell you the truth, I mean, Snuka wasn't even really the focal point here because they essentially use this as a buffer segment to further along the whole Macho Man Crush drama. On-screen drama, by the way, that we can actually have a reason to give a fuck about. As opposed to backstage, behind-the-scenes AEW drama between lousy executives and top guys that we have no reason to care about. But this week, we had Crush on the phone again with Bobby Heenan. And Heenan's just twisting that knife further into this deal by asking Crush why he's not competing in the IC title battle royal next week, even though the Macho Man is. And of course, this is the first time Crush has heard of this news, so he responds by saying he wasn't invited to compete in the battle royal, despite being at 100% physically. God, he was so great here when he threw in that line about how the Macho Man was entered into the battle royal, saying, yeah, and I think he was one of the first guys entered too. What a fucking douchebag line that was. Love it. You know, meanwhile, Crush is sitting there going, yeah, that doesn't surprise me, brother. Figures Savage would weasel his way into the battle royal somehow. And of course, Savage is firing back with, dude, you got a problem? Say it to me right now. I've been trying to call you all week and you keep ducking me. Don't go airing this dirty laundry out in public like this. You got a problem? Say it to my face. You know, by that point, Crush had heard enough and hung up the phone again. So, yes, the plot thickens here with these two. And lo and behold, it's an actual legitimate heat between two guys we can buy because, you know, it's not petulant bullshit where everyone's acting like 8-year-old girls arguing over who's not hanging out in whose playgroup. It's two grown adult men with a beef, and Savage is trying to get answers. Meanwhile, Crush is ducking him like a coward. It's good stuff. You know, and you really want to find out what Crush's motive is here. What's his issue with Savage? Where did all this come from? Because it came virtually out of nowhere. I mean, I'll say this. It's one of the better stories they ever wrote for Crush in the WWF. I was never a particular fan of his. I never saw or understood what WWF's obsession was with pushing the guy for so long. But they put him in a big featured spot here with the Macho Man, and it panned out well for him. He got a big WrestleMania payout for it. So that was all great. Oh, and there's a match going on meanwhile, in case you forgot. I mostly caught the end where Snuka hit the job guy with a really cool-looking slingshot suplex, and then he put him away with the signature splash. At least he still had the patented splashdown packed. And that was followed with a very obscure pre-tape with IRS. First, they covered the match where Rotunda got rolled up by PJ Walker, thanks to Razor Ramon getting involved. So that resulted in them filming this skit with Rotunda in what appeared to be his tax headquarters. It was a very dark room. There were two secretaries standing by his side filing paperwork. One lady was pretending to type numbers into a calculator while the other was on the phone nodding her head incessantly. And they were very into the secretarial work. One might say they were acting. The one girl on the phone, I have no idea how she would have been able to hear the conversation on the other line, because for the entirety of this segment, we had IRS cutting a promo on Razor, saying that he's going to regret fucking him over in that match, because now he has an audit coming his way. And the only thing I could think the entire time this segment was going on was, God, poor Rotunda. What a phenomenal wrestler he was in his heyday, yet here he is working for the WWF in 1993 under a fucking fake tax collector gimmick. I mean, not that WCW got it right a few years later when he showed up on Nitro's M Wall Street, but God, this is so hokey. Career sabotage. There we go. And, well, we saw how it panned out years later with Bray Wyatt, because Vince did just about everything to bury that guy 10 feet underground, so guess it runs in the family. Speaking of hokey, we had this WWF title match with the Quebecers. As noted from last week, we were supposed to get the Quebecers and the Steiners in a title rematch, seeing as how Scotty beat Pierre in a singles match. But in one of the show closing angles, the Quebecers cut a promo pretty much saying, yeah, we lied. And I guess that was enough for President Jack Tunney to say, well, all right then. Guess my hands are tied. Can't book that match because the Quebecers said no. So they had this little pre-match deal where Bobby Heenan is in the ring with Barry Horowitz, the ultimate WWF jobber of all job talent. And, well, if it wasn't bad enough that Barry Horowitz was scheduled to get a WWF Tag Team Championship match on this episode of Raw, but his partner, not making this up, by the way, Reno Riggins, came down with the flu. However, he has a suitable replacement partner here. Someone that he believes is just as qualified, if not more, than Reno fucking Riggins. It's a big stretch. But he thinks he found the guy. And that guy being the 1-2-3 Kid, who I can confirm, and I don't think I'm being unfair here when I say, probably just as qualified to team with Barry here as Reno fucking Riggins, who I will continue to refer to him until the end of time, and I don't believe we've ever seen Reno fucking Riggins on the show. But, hey, give Horowitz his dues. This is probably the highlight of his entire career. The match was fairly basic early on. You had the babyface shine real early where Waltman and Horowitz were hitting the Quebecers with a bunch of flashy drop kicks and sending them out to the floor. Finally, the heels were able to cheap shot Waltman from behind and cut him off. And that led to this phenomenal heat spot right before the break where Waltman ended up drop kicking Jacques out to the floor. And they played up the story where Jacques was out cold. Meanwhile, Earl Hebner is just standing in the ring playing with himself while Johnny Polo is calling for them to haul out the gurney to call the match off. Because yes, it was totally apparent at this point that the Quebecers were fucked in this match with the 1-2-3 Kid and Barry Horowitz of all people. They were in grave danger of losing the belts here, so they needed an outing, a master plan. And in the most comedic manner possible, officials hurriedly carried a gurney out to ringside so that they could recklessly and haphazardly pick up Jacques by his arms and legs, throw him on the gurney without strapping him down, and then try to roll him to the back. And I guess we were supposed to believe or assume that the heels were intentionally feigning this injury to get out of the match, So Hebner basically said, yeah, we're not having any of this bullshit. The match is going to continue. Okay. Great idea in theory. Here's the problem. Because Jacques left on the gurney and he never came back. So Fink says that even though one of these guys is practically paralyzed and unable to compete, this match will continue anyway. Seems like a rather douchey thing to do when a guy goes down with an injury, but, well, it is Earl Hebner we're talking about here. He didn't have a reputation for being the most reliable official. But the absurdity continues with this whole thing, wherein after the break, when they come back, not only is the match now 2-on-1, advantage babyfaces, but the heel, the guy with the disadvantage, is actively kicking the babyfaces' asses. To which I wrote down here, who's booking this thing? Russo? Yes. The bad guy, the villain, the one we're supposed to boo in this situation, was valiantly fighting from underneath at a disadvantage and winning over the heroes. And you'll never guess what they did for the finish. Not kidding. This is what happened. 1-2-3 Kid goes for a spinning kick into Pierre, but he ends up getting dumped out over the top rope onto the floor. Actually took a great looking bump for it too. Looked like he killed himself. And while Hebner is holding back Horowitz, Johnny Polo throws Waltman back into the ring. And they're laying there on the mat. Pierre's stirring a little bit. And he throws an arm over Waltman's chest. And Hebner counts 1. He counts 2. And he counts 3. So just to recap here. A heel went down with an injury, which left the one heel to have to fend for himself and valiantly defend the WWF Tag Titles alone because the ref was an asshole and decided to let the match continue anyway. And not only did the heel fight at a 2-on-1 disadvantage, but he was winning at said disadvantage. And in the end, he still managed to outsmart the babyfaces and retain the belts anyway. I fail to see how this was designed to garner sympathy for the babyfaces. Seriously, this booking was so ass backwards. If I didn't know any better, I'd have thought Russo was writing this shit. Because this was the exact kind of garbage that we saw during the dying days of Nitro. I am not making any of this up, by the way. Everything that I just described for you happened on plain view. Right on camera. For the whole world to see. It is on Peacock as we speak. You don't believe me? Just go search it. WWF Raw, September 27th, 1993. It's the main event. It's right there. They indeed booked a tag title match wherein, by the end, the goal seemed to be to get people to sympathize with the heels. And they unquestionably cut the babyfaces' balls out from under them. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we would call in professional wrestling a complete, total burial. So anyway, moving on. We had a quick Razor promo at the end here to hype up the Battle Royal next week. Didn't say a whole lot because it looked like they were a little pressed for time here. All he did was call out IRS to tell him that if he has a problem with him in the Battle Royal, he can come deal with him personally. And they teased the idea of the match coming down to Savage and Razor, which I don't remember if that was the case or not. I know Razor was one of the last two participants, but can't remember if Macho Man was in the final two or not. Guess we'll find out next week. It would be kind of obscure to do a babyface versus babyface, though, because I know Vince really wasn't all that fond of doing that back in the day. But, yeah, that was Retro Raw. A very scatter chart of good and bad this week. The opening match with Tatanka and Martel was fun for what it was. The Ludwig Borga squash was what it was. The Jimmy Snuka match is always going to be up to interpretation based on how you feel about him personally. And the WWF Tag Title Match was a perfectly fine wrestling match if you completely discount the backwards booking logic of it. It's one of those instances where if you just watch it in a vacuum and you turn your brain off, it was a pretty good match. But when you start thinking about it for more than 2 seconds, you're like, yeah, that booking was stupid. But I think the main takeaway from this was that they laid the groundwork for the next couple weeks with the story kind of settling around the Intercontinental title. And obviously it's part of a bigger picture too, because even though they stripped Shawn of the belt, when he ends up coming back, they build to the story around him in early 94 claiming to be the real Intercontinental Champion since he was never beaten for it. And he ends up, walking in with his version of the title, even though Razor was the real champion at the time. And spoiler alert for the Battle Royal, but this is pretty well-known history for the Shawn-Razor feud. And obviously, we all know what that sets up for WrestleMania with the ladder match between the two. A gimmick match that was done right one time in history and was never done right afterwards, unfortunately. Even though they tried to modify it by throwing in tables and chairs and other furniture over the years. And unfortunately, the more I see of ladder matches in modern wrestling, the more I'm vindicated in that opinion. So SmackDown. Do I have any volunteers to talk about this show? Nah, I'm just kidding. Like I said before, it wasn't that bad, but I had some issues with it, to say the very least. So this was September 23rd, 2022. And we opened the show with, I think I got this right based on the t-shirts, The Ones. And not only did we have the regular Bloodline coming out, but we had the return of the Tribal Chief. The head of the table, one might say. Yes, the official TV return for Roman Reigns. And one of the first things I snidely wrote down here, oh, thank God, Paul Heyman picked a solid color suit this week. After the checkered pattern incident last week, I think someone had a talk with Paulie beforehand and said, why don't we go with something less exploitive? Just helping a brother out. So this segment, I was fixing to hate this thing. And for about the first 15 minutes, I did. Because when this thing first started, and you had Paul Heyman standing there droning on and on and on about God knows what, I'm just sitting there looking at my clock going, is there ever going to be a point to anything this guy is saying right now? Seriously, was I the only one asking that question? Let me know if I'm missing anything. The entire first half of this promo segment was a complete nothing burger. It was Roman Reigns telling the Utah fans to acknowledge him, Paul Heyman jaw-jacking with the crowd, not knowing what to refer to them as. Missed a golden opportunity there to call the Utah fans Utes. Like, come on, that joke writes itself. Said something about Solo Sikoa being the official enforcer for Roman Reigns while the Usos go about their duty. And that was the extent of it. And that basically led to Roman telling Solo to acknowledge him so that they can officially pledge him into the Bloodline dynasty, which he did. So it was a complete waste of 10 minutes. But then came the second half, because they hit the Bloodline theme music, and They all go to leave, but Sammy tells them to cut the feed because he's got some he wants to address to Roman. He wants to pledge his allegiance to the Bloodline too. And, Roman's basically jerking Sammy around and lowballing him at every turn, saying, dude, what is this? Why are you tagging along with the group? Why are you out here? What do you want? More importantly, why are you wearing a Bloodline t-shirt? And things get real serious here as Roman tells Sammy, take that shirt off. This is so great too, because when you watch the way they film this, you got the Bloodline standing alongside Roman, and they're all backing him and yelling at Sammy to take the shirt off. Meanwhile, Paul Heyman is standing in the periphery behind Sammy the entire time with his hand covered over his mouth like, oh dear God, this man is going to die in front of my very eyes. Paulie, dude. Say what you want about the guy, but the man has mastered the art of subtlety. So obviously they're teasing this deal here that the Bloodline is about to burn Sammy at the stake and eat his remains on live television here. And they even go as far as to have one of the Usos forcibly tear the Bloodline shirt off of Sammy because he refused to comply and take it off by himself. In the final minute of this segment, they managed to turn this around and pop me. As Roman looks at Sammy and goes, you ain't ever going to wear that shirt again. Because I got you a new one. And he tosses the shirt at Sammy. Sammy looks at the front print, and his face gets all elated. And he slowly turns the shirt around to reveal to the camera, and it says, Sami Zayn, Honorary Oos, in big bold letters. And everyone in the crowd went, yeah! And everyone's doing all the Sammy, Sammy, Sammy chants. Seriously, it's probably the biggest babyface pop this guy's gotten since his NXT run, like almost a decade ago. And of course, he goes in to hug Roman, and everyone's all happy and excited for the guy. Everyone except Jey Uso, who they're still teasing as the one guy in the group that has dissension with the guy. And when this is all over, the only thing I thought to myself was, God damn, it's going to be so sad when the Bloodline finally turns on him and leaves him for dead. It's going to be a great title program, though. Can't wait for that. So that went from being a massive thumbs down to a massive thumbs up. A great segment by the end. You know what wasn't great? Liv Morgan versus Lacey Evans. This sucked. If you want the classic model for a match where it looks like two people wrestling underwater, this ain't a bad one. Liv Morgan, dude. Again, no offense to her. I'm sure she's a nice gal. I'm sure she's a real sweet, down-to-earth person. Very effeminate. Because she looks like she would never harm a fly. She didn't look like she would ever voluntarily get herself into any trouble with anybody. And when you really boil it down, that's the problem. It's the problem I've had with Liv Morgan since pretty much the first time I ever saw her work. She doesn't look like a wrestler. She's, 5 feet tall? Maybe $110 at the most? Like, who would ever take this chick seriously as a wrestler, much less being your top champion? She looks like your average everyday girl on OnlyFans. Sorry, I don't buy the whole Liv Morgan thing. And I can promise you that I'm not the only one saying that. Because there are a lot of people in the same boat as me. Probably for different reasons, but I think we're all in agreement here that this Liv Morgan thing is not working. They've been running with it for quite a while now. I just don't buy anything she does. Whether it's the ring work, the promos, it doesn't matter. You know, the fact that I'm supposed to buy the idea that she's going to have a semi-competitive hardcore match at the pay-per-view with Ronda fucking Rousey of all people? Get the fuck out of here. Like, not only is it visually insulting, but it's one of the dumbest stories you can possibly tell with one of your champions, wherein we're all supposed to sympathize with Liv because she's too weak or afraid to be extreme. That's your story? From my vantage point, if Ronda doesn't go in there at the pay-per-view and smashes a girl in 2 minutes or less, then this whole thing can go piss up a rope sideways. And for the record, you want to know how you don't make your champion look strong going into a pay-per-view match when she's supposed to be facing a legit MMA fighter? You have her sell for 90% of a TV match against an undercard girl and then win with a fluke pin. I mean, that's just a recipe for making your champion continue to look like a joke and look like she can't fight her way out of a wet paper bag. And again, if that's the story they're going with, fine. It's a dumb story, but whatever. You know, and for anyone out there that's going to try and argue this with me in the comment section, we've seen this stupid WWE storyline before. No, the fluke champion story was never, has never, and will never be good no matter how you try and spin it. They've done this story before. It's always sucked, and it will continue to suck through the annals of time. Your champion should not be inferior. Your champion should not be weak. That's just basic common sense booking. And I don't care if they do it with the men's division or the women's division. It's stupid both ways. Looking past that, we did have a great segment in the back here with Sammy. Granted, they had to throw Ricochet and Madcap Moss in there too, but it ended up being worth it by the end because they're going back and forth with the verbal jousting. And while the babyfaces are trying to malign Sammy for being a douche, Solo Sikoa runs in from off camera and pretty much beels Ricochet and Moss into the garage door. Also made better by Ricochet taking a phantom bump into the door after Sikoa rammed his head into it a couple times. And to cap it off, Sammy with the perfect go-home line, while he's pulling Sikoa back, he goes, "Thanks, Oos. I was just about to do that to them myself." God, Sammy's such a prick. I love it. And that was followed with a great video package for the Usos to highlight their 432nd day as tag team champions. By the way, I'm sensing a theme on this show in terms of good versus bad material and how most of the good material is all centered around the Bloodline and everything else is the rest. I mean, correlation does not always equal causation, but I'm just throwing it out there. But this video package, it was particularly helpful for me because it gave me some clarification on how the Usos not only won the first set of tag team titles in, I think, July of last year, the graphic said, but how they also beat Orton and Riddle to win the other set of belts too, which basically showing us how they became the undisputed tag team champions. And now they only trail behind Demolition, and God, was this some historical insight I never needed to revisit again, The New Day, as the only two teams in WWE history to hold the titles longer than the Usos. Allegedly, The New Day held the belts for 483 days before finally losing them, which I feel like I probably should remember, seeing as how it wasn't all that long ago, but I mean, you also heard me sit here last week and rant on how much I've always despised the New Day gimmicks, so to say I've tried to forget much of their run would be a mild statement, but apparently they hold the record for longest reigning tag team champions, and God, I hope that can only come to an end soon. And speaking of the booty-shaking, trombone-playing, pancake-flipping numbskulls, well, they were out next. Set to wrestle the Maximum Male Models, and getting me to voluntarily sit through a New Day Maximum Male Models match at this stage is on par with pulling teeth, so I happily fast-forwarded through this complete waste of 10 minutes. And at that point, I went right to Brawny the Strowman versus Otis. And guess who they put in charge to officiate this thing? Where in one corner, you have a grown 350-pound man going against another 350-pound grown man. Guess who the referee was? Yep, you guessed it. The 115-pound female referee. Am I the only one that actually finds that remotely offensive? Or have we just completely lowered our standards so much in wrestling anymore where we just accept the absurdity of seeing a frail woman trying to control and monitor two giant fucking men having a hoss fight? So anyway, remember last week when they set this up and I said I was fearful that they were going to manage to fuck this up with the booking? Well, they fucked it up. Or I guess a better way of putting it would be they didn't take the smart approach when it came to protecting Strowman and getting him over the right way. Instead, they had a prototypical WWE match wherein by the end, Strowman ended up coming out looking weaker than he did going in. I said it last week. You can go back and check out the show for reference. I said the worst possible thing they could do right now is have Strowman sell and get worked over for an extended period of time. The guy literally just came back. The people have popped for the moments where he just comes out and steamrolls through guys in 2 minutes or less. Why in the hell you would want to book that guy in any vulnerable situation right now where guys are getting heat on him? I have no earthly clue. But, I mean, you don't have to rake me over the coals for it. I didn't book the thing. I'm just reporting on it. The people popped for the finish when Strowman got Otis up for the jackknife, but again, why we're putting Strowman in vulnerable situations where he's getting knocked off his feet this early in the game, I don't get it. I think it's a dumb move, and all it does is lessen the ability for heels to get real heat on the guy during angles at later points. Because once you've already established the guy can be knocked down easily, all you're doing is lessening the guy's value and appeal. You want to do something like this 2 or 3 months down the road? Fine. But how long has Strowman been back now? Like 3 weeks? And they're already doing this crap with him? Bad call. But again, I'm not the booker. I'm just a guy that's watched successful wrestling promoters book big men in the territories for years now and saw how it was actually done right. Be it a face or a heel. Doesn't matter. Strowman went over with a powerbomb. Like I said, people pop for the finish, which is pretty much the only thing that people actually react to in wrestling anymore. So what's that really saying at the end of the day? And this went down pretty much exactly as I anticipated it would. And for the record, that's not a good thing either. And that was followed with another baffling segment that left me shaking my head by the end. In a previous time, I would have probably been shouting and mother effing this thing until the cows came home. But, well, because I know wrestling sucks now and nobody knows how to book it properly, I just kind of shrugged off by the end and went, well, that was unproductive. And dumb as fuck. So it starts with Drew McIntyre coming down to the ring, and he has a leather strap in his hand, because I guess they just figured nobody would have been able to put 2 and 2 together before the guy even opened his mouth to make the pay-per-view announcement. But I'll cut to the chase with this whole thing, because he pretty much let the cat out of the bag as soon as he came out with it. Yes, at Extreme Rules, in the first installment of Karrion Kross versus Drew McIntyre, after not having wrestled a straight match prior to this, they're going directly to the gimmicks. It's going to be a strap match. So, I mean, that already kind of left me rolling my eyes, but I figured, okay, whatever. Maybe they'll have Kross come out and whip McIntyre here and get some heat on him, and they can build anticipation to see McIntyre get his revenge at the Extreme Rules show in a few weeks. You know how you would properly set this up if you were a booker that knew what you were doing and you were trying to build hype for a pay-per-view match. Boy, did those words get shoved in my rectum by the end. Because here's what they did instead. Kross's music hits, We see Scarlett coming out from the rampway while Cross tries to sneak in the back door and attack Drew from behind. Only this time, Drew scouts the attack and manages to get the upper hand on Cross, wherein at this point, he runs Cross shoulder first into the post, and he proceeds to latch on the strap to Cross's wrist, while Cross is hunched over in the corner, laying up against the second turnbuckle. Now keep that in mind because it's important. Drew has to take the time to attach Cross's wrist to the other end of this leather strap, which takes him a good 10 to 15 seconds to do so, and all the while, Cross has to pretend like he is totally helpless and cannot fight back, even though he's standing on 2 feet and squatted over in the corner with a free hand, making it very easy for him to just deck Drew in the side of the head and run for the hills. But no, he just stands there like an idiot while Drew locks his wrist to the other end of the strap, and wouldn't you know it, the moment Cross realizes he's stuck on the other end, now he's scared. Now he's cowering in fear while Drew begins to unload and legitimately beat the shit out of him. Cross is trying to run away. Drew's beating him. Cross leaves the ring, tries to run up the ramp. Drew pulls him back into the ring, and he's beating him again. Whipping him like a government mule, to coin a great phrase. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there the entire time asking myself, why exactly am I being enticed to watch this match when they are giving me the babyface redemption angle on free television 2 weeks before they expect me to pay to see the payoff? And I get it's a Peacock subscription, but I'm speaking in hypotheticals here. Well, the answer is, whoever put this segment together is a retard and doesn't understand wrestling booking logic 101. But it gets dumber. We're not out of the woods yet. Oh, no. There's more. There's much more. Because while Cross is selling in the corner, Scarlett runs in, and she starts begging for Drew to back off. And when Drew goes over to pull Cross back to his feet, Scarlett attempts, in big bold fonts there that I wrote in my notes, she attempts to fireball Drew in the face. The key word is attempt. And this was so poorly mistimed, I don't think the announcers could figure out whether or not Drew ducked the fireball attempt, or if they just did not want to flat out say, whoops, live television, folks. Sorry about that. Scarlett just botched this whole angle poorly. So after this failed fireball attempt, Drew continues to beat Cross like a drum. He ends up laying him out with a spine buster, wherein finally, after all of this, Scarlett just runs in and cock blocks Drew. And that was finally how the babyface was thwarted. The 240-pound monster badass couldn't take care of Drew, but the 110-pound female eye candy can give Drew one groin shot. One good little blow to the gonads. That was enough to lay the guy out. Yeah, this was fucking awful. This was the exact kind of tape that I would show to a booker or promoter of what not to do when you are trying to build up pay-per-view hype. Everything from making your heel look like a schlub, to completely botching a fireball angle, to booking a gimmick match for a show before we've seen the two guys in a regular singles match. This was pretty much every polar opposite of the word correct or effective booking. So after that sheer catastrophe, I had some time I needed to make up for here. Luckily, they followed that with another girls' match, which made it an easy skip for me. No offense to Dakota Kai or Raquel Gonzalez, Raquel Lopez, Raquel Fernandez, Raquel Ramirez, whatever she's going by these days. But, yeah, these girls aren't Bayley or Becky Lynch or even Rhea Ripley in terms of talents that justify me wanting to watch two girls' matches in one sitting. especially not after that fucking Liv Morgan match. Plus, I actually wanted to check out the main event with the Usos defending the tag titles against the Brawling Brutes. With whatever energy I had remaining after being drained having watched this show. Oh, and by the way, I probably should bring this up since I completely forgot about this. I believe here was the point in the show where Cole and Graves just casually dropped the story about Solo Sikoa being stripped of the North American title because reasons, apparently. I believe Cole said something about him not being a sanctioned participant in the match where he initially won the belt, to which I said, then how in the fuck did he get booked in the match to begin with? But, yeah, I guess that was all for naught. They literally put a developmental belt on Solo just to take it off him a week later and basically chalk it up to, yeah, that shit never happened. Memory hold. And we wonder why no one cares about belts anymore. Anyway, the match was all right for what it was. A little bit of choppiness at points from both teams, and I still have no idea what the hell they were going for, where the Usos nearly killed Pete Dunne with that apron spot. I presume the Brutes were the babyfaces in this match, even though I think we were supposed to view it as heel versus heel going in. I don't know. I mean, the Usos were definitely getting the heat on the Brutes for a good chunk of it, so it's probably why I figured they were supposed to be the heels. They did a total BS spot at the end where Jay tagged Jimmy by the foot when Dunne sent him out to the floor. Somehow this constituted a legal tag, even though any tag that doesn't involve direct hand-to-hand contact is always bullshit. They actually had a pretty great spot here at the end where Dunne tried to do the second rope moonsault into the Usos, but they caught him with a perfectly timed super kick. Of course, it was only a near fall, but the spot initially looked great. That was until they showed the replay where you see the obvious thigh slaps from the Usos. Yeah, but they led up to some nice false finishes at the end that everyone went crazy for. I love that spot where Ridge deadlifted the Usos and then threw them into a modified overhead backdrop. It was right before they set up the finish with Pete Dunne. That was a great looking spot. And, that eventually led to one of those old school chaotic finishes where it all breaks down. But it was actually paid off well in execution. Sami Zayn tried to grab a chair, but Sheamus ran in to thwart him. And while Sheamus was distracted running him off, Imperium all came down and laid him out in the aisleway, including Walter, who decked Sheamus with a great-looking boot. And when Pete and Ridge ran out to try and make the save for their bud, the Usos caught them both with super kicks on the floor, and they threw Pete back into the ring and hit him with a 1D for the finish. It was a relatively hot finish, too. It was the only match on the show with that level of run and stuff where it didn't seem like overkill by the end, so I was okay with it. Not that there was any real expectation that the Brawling Brutes are winning these straps on free TV like this with 1 week's build, but yeah, again, people were into it. And especially after that video package too. I mean, trust me, these guys are in it for the long haul. I wouldn't be surprised to see them top the New Day's title run, which evidently will mean we'll probably have to see another fucking match with those guys at some point, which, whatever. I mean, at least there'd be a story reason for it. So that was that. Really didn't have much else to add to the match. The Usos are what they are at this point. I've been on the fence about boycotting their stuff in recent times, mostly because they've been overexposed to death to the point of absurdity. But, their role with the Bloodline at least covers up for the flaws of seeing them rammed down my throat for the better part of 10 years. The Brawling Brutes faction is goofy to me, and I don't really get the appeal of it. It seems like another one of those hangover ideas from Vince that Hunter doesn't really know how to do away with right now, so he's just kind of running with it for the time being until he can figure out what to do with all three of them. I mean, I still like the idea of Walter and Sheamus in a rematch for the IC title. The other guys I can take or leave, if I'm being honest. Speaking of things I can take or leave, I can definitely take the leave for this episode. God, this was bad. Am I being harsh on it? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, the main event was a fun match, but the rest of the show had all kinds of booking problems. Like, more so than I'm used to. Like, that McIntyre Cross segment was one of the worst things I've seen on wrestling television all year. And there have been some pretty bad AEW skits. Like, that whole House of Black thing with the Julia Hart angle and I think it was the Lucha Brothers. Like, that was bad. But, dude, this McIntyre Cross segment, I mean, it definitely cut Cross's balls out from under him. I have no idea who came up with that, but whoever did, they need to be immediately fired and or castrated. And or both. You know, the Strowman match was also a booking head scratch, but I mean, it wasn't as insulting as the McIntyre Cross angle. Obviously, there's the whole Liv thing, which I'm not going to delve back into again. It's ridiculous. You know, what else is there to say about it? Anybody that actually buys her as a legit champion, much less a legit believable athlete going up against Ronda, you're a fucking tool. And there's no other way to sugarcoat it. Either that or you're just a flat-out mark for Liv Morgan, which, in that case, I have to question your taste in women. The other stuff was at least skippable or unmemorable, or I won't lose any sleep over it having watched it. But whatever positives I could take away from last week's show, which, looking back, I don't recall being that bad of an episode, this one didn't hit home too well. This is a pretty bad misfire on all accounts. So before we put this one to bed, make sure you guys stop back this coming Friday for the next show, where we'll be breaking down AEW's next Dynamite episode and seeing what they're building towards as we approach their Full Gear show in November. I don't know, considering they've got the belt on Moxley again, it doesn't give me any high hopes right now, but if the end goal is to get the strap on MJF, then I can trudge through another meaningless, underwhelming world title run with the Jiffy Lube associate. But at least we'll have the Retro Review series to make up for whatever horrors await us on the Turner Network this coming Wednesday night. So we will wait and see. Until then, take care all. Peace.